You're watching ABC News 24 on the day that the US President Barack Obama has announced that the face of terror, Al-Qaeda leader Osama Bin Laden, is dead, killed in a firefight with US forces inside Pakistan. And I'm joined in the studio by Brendon O'Connor from the US Studies Centre. One of those things that Lee Sales just mentioned in her package there was that the threat to the United States, and indeed its allies around the world, will not be over simply because Osama Bin Laden is dead.
No, I mean, this retaliation that's been threatened in the Guantanamo Bay papers that WikiLeaks recently released, there were all sorts of threats that if Bin Laden was killed, nuclear technology would be unleashed, biological weapons, chemical weapons. Now, that might be an idle threat or an exaggeration, but I imagine security forces around the world at airports and whatnot are probably on reasonably high alert, thinking, well, he was popular in some parts of the world, not with majorities in any country, but there were pockets of support. Opinion polling is actually quite good on this, in Pakistan, quite high levels of support at various times in the past. So it will be interesting to see what, it'll be a few nervous days in some ways to see what the reaction is. And that reaction outside of the White House will be used, I imagine, in certain propaganda sort of campaigns or battles that will go on, seeing people cheering his death, whether that will be used to sort of get sympathy for him as a martyr in some
I imagine that it will be, because what we've seen since September the 11th is, try as they might, Al-Qaeda had never managed again to stage such a massive terrorist attack. There had been plenty of other terrorist operations, but there was always debate, particularly in the United States, about whether or not Al-Qaeda's influence was waning, because try as they might, they hadn't been able to stage anything along the lines of what we saw on September the 11th. However, the news of Osama Bin Laden's death, are you saying that that might be just that little bit of extra motivation people need to try to carry out those attacks?
I think the bar is raised so much higher. I mean, the sense of security is much greater, as we all experience at airports, and I suppose with the coordination within the United States between the CIA, the FBI, these forces that really had enough information maybe to prevent the September 11 attacks. So I think it's much, much more difficult. The question that has really been on everyone's concern is, well, if they've got some sort of nuclear byproduct, some dirty bomb, would that ever be released? Now that's the thing that I suppose haunts people who look at this area, and I suppose hope that this isn't the case.
We're actually seeing live pictures outside the White House in Washington where hundreds of people have gathered. This announcement from the President Barack Obama in the address to the nation coming very late on a Sunday night US time, and hundreds of people have now gathered outside the White House to cheer this news. So as you were mentioning, Brendon, these pictures, I imagine, will go all the way around the world. In parts of the Middle East, they will not go down too well. But when we're talking about the effectiveness of Osama Bin Laden, it had been discussed in the United States for some time that it was really his number two, Zawahiri, who perhaps had taken control of operation and planning, that Osama Bin Laden was just on the hunt, just on the run so much that he didn't actually have day-to-day control over Al-Qaeda operations.
Yeah, I mean, the pictures are quite remarkable. It's near midnight in the United States, not exactly the warmest part of the year.
No.
So
I think last time that many people were down there was when Barack Obama was elected, quite frankly.
Spontaneous. Looks like a lot of students from a nearby university, University of George Washington University. But I mean, your point about who controls Al-Qaeda, it was always the case that Bin Laden in some ways was not the key ideas man. At times he might have been leading some of the strategy. He fought in sometimes a very sort of high-risk battles against the Soviets in that war in Afghanistan in the 1970s and through into the 80s. So he was always a figure that was part of a network of people who had these ideas, and these ideas, I suppose, boiled down to being a very anti-American set of ideas, as I said before, late in the piece. It wasn't always the case that America was the target. The Soviets were the target for a long time. So whether there needs to, I think it's hard to see a recalibration of those ideas. It's more how recruitment will occur. And that's been a major problem for them, really, in recent times.
And certainly there was a lot of speculation that Osama Bin Laden was somewhere along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. We're being told that he has been killed in a compound well inside Pakistan. There's a map on our screen at the moment showing the location of where that strike was. Now, there were two schools of thought. Some people thought that, yes, he was in this sort of system, between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The CIA had their chance to get get him at Tora Bora. They, missed, depending on who you believe, by hours, days, getting him and finding out where he was, whether he was still in that border region or whether he was further inside Pakistan. There were two schools of thought about that.
Yes, I mean, fascinating. I mean, living in caves in Afghanistan is a very tough life, and if he was living in something that some news agents sees reporting as a mansion in Pakistan, this would have made, I think, people's blood boil if there was a sense that he got away. He's been living this relatively comfortable life, would have given people this idea.
But we don't know how long he might have been there.
It's
one
all
can only
speculation.
assume that he was on the move quite a bit, but because occasionally he would release audio tapes, wouldn't he? The days of a video message from Osama Bin Laden had been long gone. It was his number two, Zawahiri, who was appearing on video, but occasionally Osama Bin Laden would release an audio tape commenting about something in the news to sort of, as a proof of life that he was still alive.
Yeah, that the battle was still going on, and in some ways it was a sort of an attempt at the battle of wills. And I think one of the interesting things that Obama said was the United States hangs tough, it stands firm, it doesn't give up. And this was always the image that Bin Laden wanted to get across. The United States will give up, that the American interests are temporary, the American attention span is temporary to any conflict. And I think Obama was very much wanting to say, no, we're resolute, we've achieved a goal, and this will help us in some ways maybe pivot to something else.
What sort of a morale boost do you think this is for the national security and intelligence apparatus in the United States? Because they'd certainly copped a pounding after September the 11th, that they didn't see it coming, they weren't prepared, they couldn't protect the United States. There have been massive upheavals, inquiries, investigations, reorganisations, restructures, new director of national intelligence, and on and on and on it went. This must be a massive morale boost for them.
Well, quite rightly. I mean, they were questioned. They were questioned over not just September 11, 2001, but WMD in Iraq, of course, as well. So I think there's had to be a pretty significant rehaul. It's, as I said before, it's a big boost to Leon Panetta, who's been head of the CIA. He'll go on to be head of defence. But Panetta has no background in the military. He's not a military man by training. He's a congressman. And his issue will be cutting budgets. His issue as head of defence will be, how do we cut the budget? How do we reduce the amount we're spending on foreign wars? And so that, I think, in this event in some ways may help that story. It may help America reduce its expenses in Afghanistan, declare in some ways that its ultimate sort of target has been taken out, and the relations with the Taliban, which are incredibly messy and difficult, will in some ways be pushed to the side, or at least not explained away in the way that if Bin Laden was still this lingering thing out there, it might have suggested, well, America hadn't completed the job properly. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how the White House pitch this in the days ahead.
It'll also be interesting, won't it, to see American public opinion about the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, because certainly in the situation of Afghanistan, many people felt, look, that is the country that the US went into immediately after September the 11th. That was the conflict that was justified on the grounds of getting the people who were responsible for September the 11th. Almost 10 years of that war, and the Americans still find themselves bogged down there, yet they've now got that person that they claim was responsible for September.
Yeah, I mean, very good question. I was in Washington in 2008 at a place called the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and there was an ex-ambassador to Pakistan based there. And I said to him near the election, I said, well, what happens if Osama Bin Laden is killed in the next sort of few months or next year? Does that really change the game? And he gave me this sort of look of, well, yes, that is quite a good question. I mean, would it allow us in some ways to get out of what is a potentially intractable conflict? Would it allow us to kind of close this up and say, okay, well, we didn't achieve everything, but we got this goal of taking Al-Qaeda out largely and its leader out? And I think that temptation for some who want to see the United States pull back from that war will be very strong.
Okay.